Before we get into that, would you please reach down into your bags, pull out your cell phones, and turn them off, please? It says other electronic devices. I have a hard time knowing exactly what that could mean, but whatever it is, please turn it off. Next week's reader will be former U.S. Poet Laureate Mark Strand. And please note that it'll be at a different time, a different day, and a different location. It's going to be Thursday, September 27th at 11 a.m. in the Gessel Knight building, which is just northeast of here, in room 3108. After the reading today, please join us for a reception in the Special Collections classroom that's just over here, directly after the reading at about 10:02. We'll have books for sale, and Professor Gessel will be available to sign. Special thanks today to the English Department, the College of Humanities, and the Lee Library, and to all of you for coming today. Now, our prayer by Jane Ann Bolter.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're thankful they're able to gather here today to listen to this reading, and we're thankful they're able to attend this university and to learn. Please help us to always remember all the things we're blessed with and to have thy Spirit with us throughout the day. And we love thee and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce one of BYU's experts in Japanese fiction, drama, and literary translation. Dr. Van Gessel is a former dean of the BYU College of Humanities. He also served as chair of the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Studies. Before coming to BYU, Dr. Gessel taught as a faculty member at Columbia University, Notre Dame, and the University of California at Berkeley. He is renowned for his work as the primary translator for the Japanese Catholic novelist Endo Shusaku, having translated 2 of his short story collections and 5 novels, the 5th of which will be published at the end of the year by Columbia Press. Dr. Gessel is also a prominent editor of several Japanese translations, including the Columbia Anthology of Modern Japanese Literature and a volume of essays co-edited with Reed Nielsen titled Taking the Gospel to the Japanese, 1901 to 2001, which received the Geraldine McBride Woodward Award from the Mormon History Association for Best International Mormon History Publication. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gessel to today's English reading series.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today and grateful to have the opportunity to talk to you about some of the things that are important to me and important to almost nobody else. I thought I might start out by talking about the joys and rewards of doing literary translation from the Japanese. Okay, I'm done with that part. You can see from my title that I have a certain level of ambivalence about what I do. I do take the words of someone else who is a superior writer and render them into my own words. That's what translation is. It's part of what translation is. But there's also the question of rending the words of someone else as we try somehow or other to deal with the issue of how do I speak for someone else. So I'll be talking about a little bit about the whole process of translation, the challenges, as well as doing some readings from my translations. In this case, just the works of Endo Shusaku, who was mentioned to you. First, we need to pay tribute to Etienne Dolet, who was burned at the stake in 1546 for a mistranslation. Fortunately, that doesn't happen as much these days. We are only burned by the reviewers, who very often suggest that our translations are wooden, which I guess is at least like unto a stake where we are burned by the reviews. So, to what should I liken the role and status of those who translate Japanese fiction? We are in some ways like a mediocre sequel to a very good movie. At our best, we're like a bottle of bubbly that has lost some of its original fizz. In our worst moments, we create our palimpsests like the work of Jackson Pollock, splashing our paints violently and randomly on top of the creator's canvas and leaving very little of the original exposed for appreciation. In my cheerier moments as a translator of Japanese fiction, I'm able to muster enough self-confidence to think of myself as a benign cipher. In my darker moments, though, which usually refers to those frequent occasions when I'm slaving over a sentence in Japanese so full of linguistic minefields that I wonder whatever possessed me to want to translate, I confess I have thought of myself as a latter-day replica of Harry Lime in Graham Greene's great film, The Third Man. Harry Lime, if you have seen the film, you will know is an imposter, a charlatan, a superfluous, shadowy figure who peddles poison and buries others so that he can assume their identity. Best of all, I think it occurred to me that a translator from Japanese shares the status of a second husband. There is no way on earth or in heaven you can ever match up to the brilliance and quality of the original. Translators over the ages and across various cultures have been called echoes, counterfeits, reflections of a very dim shadow, and a cannibalism. One post-war Japanese author wrote to his translator, "I judge that you are a parasite fattening off of Japanese literature." Needless to say, that translator did no more work by that author. The Italians have declared us persona non grata by creating the clever epithet traduttore. The translator is traditore, a traitor. Donald Keene, one of the deans of Japanese literary translation, has come up with his own pun in Japanese. Yakusha is a yakusha, or the translator is an actor. Edward Seidensticker, who among many other contributions translated the tale of Genji into English, remarked that translation is a situation requiring a choice between equally undesirable alternatives. And Arthur Waley, who was the very first to translate the complete tale of Genji into English, confessed, "There are seldom sentences that have exact word-to-word equivalents in another language. It becomes a question of choosing between various approximations." I hope you can conjure up in your minds what it feels like to be the conveyor of various approximations. My own experiences as a translator confirm the essentially masochistic tendencies that obviously beset anyone who attempts to learn Japanese, and which are present in abundance in those of us who inflict the title of translator from the Japanese on ourselves. It didn't take me long in the literary translation business, if I can use that word very loosely, to realize that I shared much in common with Alan J. Lerner, the librettist and lyricist for My Fair Lady and Camelot, who described his discipline as a minor art ranking somewhere between wood carving and photography. I don't really know whether literary translation from the Japanese is closer to wood carving or to photography, but I think I'm somewhere there in between. The translator, from his linguistic prison cell, attempts, despite all odds, to translate from a language that is not native to him into other words, often into a language that he wishes he could claim as totally his own, and then hopes that the end product bears some similarity to the original. It is a process which Jose Ortega y Gasset has cleverly termed transubstantiation, acknowledging that we are taking upon ourselves a guise of sacerdotal power and seeking to perform miracles that in reality only the gods can hope to accomplish impeccably. I'm rather fond of John Dryden's image for the impossible assignment of the translator. He said, "'Tis much like dancing on ropes with fettered legs." And perhaps Bertrand Russell was right after all when he said, "No one can understand the word cheese unless he has a non-linguistic acquaintance with cheese." And even Schopenhauer, the great Schopenhauer, weighed in on the challenges of translation. He wrote, "A library of translations resembles a gallery with reproductions of paintings." I hope by now I have convinced you of the lofty business in which I am engaged and how great I think my own work is. I do want to give you just a couple of examples, a handful of examples of how really challenging translating is from Japanese. I have taken all of these examples from published English translations of important works of modern Japanese literature. The first one is a phrase that appears in a short story written in 1950, and it says, it was translated as, a record-breaking 38 degrees, when in fact what the Japanese said was troops smash across the 38th parallel. There is a subtle distinction there. I hope you catch it. One translator rendered this passage as "my pants hurt." What it really means is "my head aches." A poor understanding of anatomy. This, translated as "sea urchin," actually means alligator. Notice how close the first two characters are in the words. There's just a little dot up there that must have been a smudge on the translator's copy of the story. And the sentence unfortunately reads, "He raised his head like a sea urchin." Try to picture that. Don't spend too much time on it, though. And honkaku, to write a book, which the author intended to say, to sign an oath denying one's faith. That's the kind of challenges we face. And now on to the individual that I have spent most of my career working with, associating with, translating for, and writing critical work about. His name is Endo Shusaku. You can see his dates there. He was, without any question, the most important Christian writer in Japan. That statement is significant for a number of reasons. First, you may know or may not know that the Christian population in Japan comprises about 1% of the total population. So to say that he is the most important Christian writer in Japan is putting him into a very small minority. That, however, does not convey the enormous popularity that he had as a writer and the enormous influence he's had on thinking about religious matters, not just among the small Christian, and in his case Catholic population, but also among many Japanese who are examining questions of what does it mean to have a spirit, what does it mean to pursue a life of spirituality. Endo was nominated several times for the Nobel Prize and came, according to my sources, very close to receiving it, but ultimately did not. It went to a different Japanese writer. He was extraordinarily prolific. Between 1955, when he began writing, until his death in 1996, he published almost 200 books, including over 50 novels and 17 short story collections, in addition to scores of books of essays, criticism, travel accounts, plays, and screenplays. Enormously versatile, he wrote in both a very serious mode, examining questions of religious conscience and faith, but was also an extremely popular writer for his humorous and entertainment writings, as he labeled them using Graham Greene's term. He received essentially every literary award available in Japan, and in 1995, just a year before his death, he was awarded the Bunkakunsho, the Order of Culture, which is Japan's highest honor for its artists. He has received honorary degrees from several foreign universities. His novels have been translated into dozens of languages, and his most acclaimed novel, Silence, was chosen as one of the 100 most influential religious books of the 20th century by HarperCollins publishers. I first became acquainted with Endo through the translation of his most popular novel called Silence, Chinmoku, which he published in 1966 and which was translated into English by a Jesuit priest in 1969. I read the English version after my mission in Japan, and because the novel deals with the struggles of a Catholic missionary in Japan in the early 17th century, I was very much drawn to Endo, his thinking, and his writing style. And 3 years later, when I entered graduate school, I decided I wanted to focus on his writings in my study and my research. During my first year as a graduate student at Columbia University, I decided after reading a few of his works in the original Japanese that I would be audacious enough to send him a fan letter. So I tracked down his address. I sent him a fan letter. I told him how much I thought of his works and said, you know, at some time in the future, I'd like to try translating one of your works. I didn't expect a response. He's a very busy man. I got a response quite quickly in which he said, go ahead and translate something. My publisher in London is waiting for something else, so get to work. Remember, first year of graduate school, I had a couple of other things on my plate. It was shortly after that I was in Japan and met Endo, which began a very close personal and professional relationship that extended from 1974, when I first met him, until his death in 1996. My first translation was accepted, and just to give you a sense of Endo and me together and the quality of my work. Oh, this is Endo, by the way. He had many faces, as I've suggested. But the quality of my work for him, Endo is on the left, in case you couldn't tell. I have no idea who that younger fellow on the right is. This actually comes from a punchline in a comic I saw somewhere. Do you not be happy with me as the translator of the books of you? And now on to the translations. This is the part where I expose myself to the greatest potential ridicule. The first work that I translated, the one I had written to him about, was called When I Whistle. It was published in Japan in 1974. And my translation was published in 1979, the year I actually received my PhD. It's a lighter novel. It is not overtly Christian, but it deals with moral issues, and most particularly a moral issue that Endo saw in the very wide gap he perceived between the Japanese generation who had lived through and survived World War II, the devastation and the occupation, and the younger generation who seemed to be far too westernized, far too interested in their own selfish pursuits, much more interested in money than they were in human relations. The story takes us back to the early days in middle school of the life of the main character named Ozu. He has a young friend at school, a really dirty, smelly, ignorant young fellow who is known by the odd name of Flatfish, Hirame. And the two of them have a crush on a beautiful young girl at their school who is named Aiko. Various things happen over the course of the novel, and ultimately, by the end, Ozu's son, who is a doctor at a research hospital, ends up performing some illegal medical experiments on Aiko, Ozu's crush from his middle school days, and she dies. Ozu, after going and paying his respects at her grave, then hops into a taxi and tries to go back to his old neighborhood. This is the closing scene from the novel. "Take me to Ashia," Ozu told the driver. The railway had fallen into disuse, but Ozu recognized the highway leading to Ashia. The vacant lots and fields, once visible on either side, were now buried under shops and petrol stations. But the station notices still remained, evoking a fathomless nostalgia and sadness in Ozu's breast. "Flatfish," he muttered, pressing his face against the window of the taxi. "Do you remember this station? The name is just the way it was." Yes, this road and the names of the stations were just as they had been then. But the young men and women who had made their way to school on the dilapidated train were not as they had been. Flatfish. So many things have happened. Then the young, bleary-eyed Flatfish muttered in his ear, "What did those days mean to us? Those days at Nara Middle School?" The taxi was slowly climbing a gentle slope. When the old highway train had reached this point, it had creaked and panted as it climbed the hill. The pine forest. Indescribable emotions filled Ozu's heart as the pines growing along the Ashia River came into view. "Where in Ashia do you want to go?" the driver asked. "The beach." "The beach?" "Yes. There's nothing there." Ozu said nothing, staring intently at the houses on either side of the highway. The great mansions with their black roofs and black fences were gone. In their place stood cheerful Western-style houses and high-class apartment buildings. A small tennis court had been built in the pine forest. Several young men were playing tennis. They came to a bridge. It was that bridge. "Cross over the bridge," Ozu cried impulsively. "Okay, straight ahead on this road." And there was Aiko's house, the house where he and Flatfish had loitered around, running their fingers along the fence. The house was gone. A stark white apartment building stood in its place. Ozu made the driver stop. He stared vacantly at the apartment house. Two foreign children were playing badminton. "That's enough," he told the driver sadly. "Take me to the beach." The sea. The sea at Ashia. Summer vacation. Great thunderhead clouds floating overhead as they swam in the blue sea. The sea. The sea at Ashia. "This is it." The driver stepped on the brakes, stopping the taxi in front of an ugly concrete embankment. "Here? There's no sea here." "I know, I told you they'd filled it in." No ocean breezes were blowing. There was none of the aroma of the sea. Ozu climbed up on the concrete embankment and gave a cry of surprise. Far into the distance, the sea had been filled in like a desert. 2 cement mixers were driving along the desolate stretch of reclaimed land. Beyond that, there was nothing. Where was the spot where flatfish, tossed about by the waves, had pursued Aiko and her friends that day? Where was the beach that Aiko and her friends had raced along, shrieking with laughter? The sea was gone now. The white beach was gone. But it wasn't just here. Beautiful things from the treasured past, were now disappearing all over Japan. Flatfish and Aiko were no longer in this world. Only Ozu was still alive. Ozu felt now that he understood what Aiko and Flatfish had meant in his life. Now, when all was lost, he felt he understood the meaning they had given to his life. He wrote both contemporary novels set in the contemporary period as well as historical novels set in the period of intense persecution of Christians in Japan in the 17th century. One of the challenges, one of the curses of being a translator from Japanese into English is that it is a very common occurrence when an English translation of a Japanese work is published that translators in Europe, throughout the major countries of Europe, will translate not from the original Japanese, but translate from the English into their language. It's called juyaku in Japanese. And so you take the original Japanese novel, this is When I Whistle, there is my English translation, and then my English translation is translated, if you can still use that word, into German, and given the lovely name Eine Klinik in Tokyo, which doesn't quite carry the same feel as When I Whistle. Something has in fact been lost in translation. But just to prove that this process of retranslating from English takes place, I found solid evidence of it in my translation of the next Endo novel called The Samurai. This is the original novel. And the first line of the novel says, Yuki ga futta. Literally, it snowed. First line of the novel, the line that's supposed to really grab you, says, it snowed. I grappled with that sentence for, I don't know, about 20 days, and finally came up with a not completely satisfactory translation, but at least it was a little more than it snowed. I came up with the brilliant, it began to snow. Now, how do I know that it was my English that was translated into European languages? Well, I was sent a copy of the Dutch translation, which said, Het begun te sneeuwen, proving that it had come from my English, not the original Japanese that simply said, it snowed. So, then in 1980 comes one of Endo's most important novels, many Japanese critics regard it as his finest literary work, titled The Samurai. This novel is also set in the early 17th century in Japan. It is a time that the Christian persecutions are beginning to mount in seriousness and scope. But it's also the time when some of the warlords out in the provinces of Japan were hoping to open up trade with foreign countries. This is before the country was closed off in 1632. Open up trade with foreign countries, and so they actually did. This is a historical event. They actually did send an embassy of lower-ranking samurai, warriors, on a ship that traveled with a Franciscan priest, called in the novel Velasco, who takes the group first to Mexico City, and then when they're unable to establish a trade agreement there, he takes them to Spain, and then to Rome, where they actually do have an audience with the Pope, and where the title character, although it's only a title, not a personal name, the samurai, as you see in these two portraits of him here that were painted in Europe, decided that it would help their cause of establishing trade ties if he would agree to be baptized as a Christian. In many ways, this is autobiographical on Endo's part because he was baptized a Christian at the age of 11 at the instigation of his mother. It was not something he chose for himself. He later described his entire literary project as being a process of taking the ill-fitting suit of Western clothes that his mother had dressed him in and retailoring them to fit his Japanese body. It's a very intriguing image. In any case, he writes about this embassy. They travel, they fail time and time again in achieving their goals. But when they reach Italy, Velasco, the priest, who is earnestly, desperately, impassionately trying to get this to work so that the church can gain further inroads in Japan and continue their missionary work, has what is for him a very depressing interview with a cardinal by the name of Cardinal Borghese. He is trying to press the case for sending more missionaries to Japan, even as word is coming into Rome that more and more Christians are being persecuted, tortured, and killed. This is a portion of that conversation. You must understand, and the narrator is Velasco the priest, you must understand, the cardinal admonished me, his hand still resting on my shoulder, that the Vatican can no longer countenance the dispatching of missionaries like yourself to a land of persecution. Just as there is no general who willingly sends his soldiers to a meaningless death on the battlefield when he knows he's defeated. No, I recovered my emotional equilibrium. Your Eminence, I do not believe Japan is a lost battleground. If our missionary endeavors have not made headway, the primitive tactics of the Jesuits are to blame. The cardinal chuckled softly. It was like the pained smile an aged schoolmaster gives an irascible child. Your Eminence, a missionary is not like a soldier. The death of a soldier can sometimes be futile. But when a missionary dies amid persecution, seeds imperceptible to the human eye are sown, seeds which manifest the glory of God. What you say is true. At the time of persecution in Rome, Peter, the first pope, planted imperceptible seeds in the hearts of men by his martyrdom. The Lord himself did not fear death on the hill of Golgotha. What you say is true. Time and again the cardinal repeated, what you say is true. Then the smile vanished abruptly from his lips to be replaced by a look of sternness. But we do not live in the age of the Lord and the apostles, my son. We run a massive organization. We have a responsibility to the Christian nations and their peoples. And as an organization, we have certain policies. Even if they seem cowardly and tainted to you, it is because of those policies that the organization is sustained. Order is preserved, and the faithful in the Christian nations can maintain their faith in confidence. But even though their numbers are few, some of the faithful are in Japan. Some have left their homes and abandoned their property, hiding in mines and in the hills so they can maintain every particle of their faith amid the persecution. As I replied, I thought of the beggarly face of the man who had come seeking confession at the construction site in Ogatsu. I don't know whether he is alive or dead now, but for the sake of people like him, I had to say to the cardinal the things that had to be said. Those believers, the cardinal said, no longer have a church. This is Velasco again. I should read the translation. Those believers no longer have a church. There are no more missionaries to encourage them, to bolster them, to set an example for them. If the Vatican is a splendid mother who protects the faithful, don't they too have the right to be embraced in her gentle arms? Aren't they now like the one lamb separated from the flock of which the Bible speaks? If, in searching for the one lamb, the other sheep are exposed to danger, the cardinal said sadly, the shepherd has no choice but to abandon that lamb. It cannot be helped if one is to protect the organization. You remind me of the words of the high priest Caiaphas when the Lord was killed. To save an entire nation, there's no choice but to sacrifice a single man. Those are the words Caiaphas spoke. Yes, the high priest Caiaphas always valued order and safety. He sacrificed the Lord Jesus to preserve order and safety. The cardinal averted his head. He sat for a long while without uttering a word, wrapped in his large cloak. I saw that my audacious remarks had angered this influential member of the Vatican hierarchy, but I no longer felt like shrinking away from him. The world has placed too much emphasis on the quest for order and safety. Endo's final serious novel, which I had the opportunity to translate, is called Deep River, Fukaikawa. He published it in 1993. He became quite ill after that, and so this is the last major work he was able to complete. It is called Deep River because it is set in India, along the banks of the Ganges, and it traces the lives of many different Japanese who have come as tourists to see the religious sites in India. Our chief character, the man with his hands folded in prayer on the left, is a Japanese man who had become a Christian, who had been mocked by his friends and classmates, including the woman seated next to him in this picture. There's a marvelous film version of this, by the way. And even though he is mocked, he decides to try to hold on to his faith. He decides he will become a priest. but he goes to learn about Christianity and how to become a missionary for the church by attending a seminary in Europe. And there, his beliefs about how Christianity can appeal to the Japanese are mocked by fellow priests and by his superiors there. Ultimately, he drops out of the seminary, finds his way to India, where he knows he will find some of the suffering, dons the robes of a Hindu priest, and carries the nearly expired bodies of the dying to the Ganges, the ultimate destination where they wish to pass into the next life. For me, the most moving scene in this novel is when this character, Otsu, the man who is a fallen priest, but certainly performing great acts of love and service, is described as follows. Already, a faint light had begun to appear outside. When he closed the door and went out into the courtyard, a scrawny cow woke up, stared at him with expressionless eyes, stood up, and sluggishly hobbled away. The streets, which by day would be filled with the voices of the Muslims chanting from their minarets, with rickshaws and with people thronging past like swirling eddies, were still hushed. The doors of the shops with their peeling paint were still tightly shut, and the city seemed like a deserted film studio backlot. The only movement came from packs of stray dogs and cows slowly rising to their feet in the middle of the streets. A feeble coolness still lingered in the air. Otsu walked the streets that would eventually be awash in dazzling light, turning to the right, then cutting to the left along roads paved with humidity and squalor. He searched after the fallen, hunched like piles of rags in deserted corners, panting for breath as they awaited the coming of death. These were they who, though taking human form, had not spent a moment of their lives able to live like human beings. They who had made their way to this city, their final hope being to die at the river Ganges. Like one who knows where cockroaches lurk, Otsu instinctively knew where in the city they would fall. It was always along slender byways, guarded from the eyes of men, places where the light of the outside world seeped wanly through cracks in a wall. Until they breathe their last, people always seek out such trickles of light, as though these are their final hope. Otsu's chapels slapped along the stone pavements, soiled with filthy water and dog droppings, then came to a stop. At his feet, an old woman leaning against a wall peered up at Otsu. Her eyes were bereft of feeling, like the eyes of the cow that had looked at him and then sauntered away. Her shoulders heaved as she panted for breath. Crouching down, Otsu took from the bag on his shoulder, an aluminum cup and a bottle filled with water. Now I'll have to beg forgiveness for my mispronunciation of the language. Pani, he gently encouraged the woman. Ap mere dost hain, water, I am your friend. He placed the aluminum cup to her tiny mouth and slowly poured the water in, but it merely moistened her chin and soaked the tattered clothing that wrapped her body. In a faint voice, she muttered, Ganga, the Ganges. When she spoke the word Ganga, a look of entreaty flickered in her eyes, and finally a tear flowed down. Otsu nodded and in a loud voice asked, Tabiat karab hai. Do you feel ill? Koibat nahin. There is no need to fear. From his bag, he took an Indian-style sling he had woven from rope, wrapped her frail body in it, and lifted her onto his back. Ganga. With her body resting on his shoulders, the old woman repeated the word over and over in a weeping voice. Pani chahiye? Do you want to drink of the waters? Otsu responded as he began to walk. By now, the morning light had begun to trickle into the city as if to suggest that God had finally noticed the sufferings of man. Shops opened their doors and flocks of cows and sheep, the bells around their necks tinkling, crossed the streets. Unlike Japan, here no one gave Otsu a strange look as he passed by with the old woman on his back. How many people, how much human agony had he taken on his shoulders and brought to the river Ganges? Otsu wiped away the sweat with a soiled cloth and tried to steady his breathing. Having only a fleeting connection with these people, Otsu could have no idea what their past lives had been like. All he knew about them was that each was an outcast in this land, a member of an abandoned caste of humanity. He could tell how high the sun had climbed from the intensity of the light that struck his neck and back. O Lord, Otsu offered up a prayer. You carried the cross upon your back and climbed the hill to Golgotha. I now imitate that act. A single thread of smoke already was rising from the funeral pyres at the Manikarnika Ghat. You carried the sorrows of all men on your back and climbed the hill to Golgotha. I now imitate that act. The novel that I recently translated that will be published at the end of this year by Columbia University Press, I have titled Kiku's Prayer. This is a story set in the 1870s. Japan has been open to the West, but it is still illegal to practice Christianity. There were, however, enclaves of hidden Christians called the kakure, the hidden ones, in Japan who were still secretly practicing their Christian faith that had been handed down for over 200 years by their ancestors. And this is the story of one of those hidden Christians, his capture and imprisonment, and a young woman of a neighboring village who, though not a Christian herself, is perhaps the most Christian of the women, most Christian of the characters in this novel. Her name is Kiku. That's why this is her prayer. And after her friend, her boyfriend Seikichi, is imprisoned, and she knows he is being tortured until he will abandon his faith, which he will not do, she pays many visits to the Temple of the Southern Barbarians, which is what the Japanese called the Christian church that had been built in Nagasaki. She pays many visits there and gives pleas in a form of non-Christian prayers to the statue of the Virgin that still stands in that church in Nagasaki today. Ultimately, in order to provide some money for Seikichi while he is in prison to try to lighten his burdens a bit, she finds the only course open to her to make sufficient money is to sell her body in one of the pleasure quarters of Nagasaki. There she contracts tuberculosis, and in her last moments, this is the scene that Endo describes. She stumbled up the stone steps of the Nambanji, the temple of the southern barbarians. Looking much like a porcelain doll, she pushed open the door and walked into the sanctuary. Tiny flames fueled by rapeseed oil glimmered at the spot where the Eucharist was laid out. When she had worked here, one of her jobs had been to refill the oil so that the flame was never extinguished. She dropped at the base of that woman's statue and coughed. A spot of blood tinged the hand she held to her mouth. With wide eyes, the statue of the Blessed Mother watched Kiku as she coughed. Well, I've ended up here again. After all, you're the only person I can talk to about Seikichi. Between coughs, she pled her cause to the Blessed Mother. I hated you, you know. Seikichi thought more of you than he did of me. I was jealous of you, and I tried to draw his heart in my direction. She coughed violently. But it didn't work. I lost everything. Unlike you, this body of mine has been repeatedly, totally violated. Tears poured from Kiku's eyes as she made her supplication. They were the same as the tears she shed the day she was raped by Ito. I can't be close to Seikichi ever again, but I really did love him. She coughed up more blood and collapsed with her face toward the floor. It was quiet in the chapel, and outside the snow fell noiselessly. When the sound of her coughing ceased, her body was no longer moving. Translucent tears, just like those of Kiku, welled up in the large eyes of the Blessed Mother. The tears spilled down her cheeks and dampened her robes. She wept for Kiku, who lay face down, motionless. She wept for this woman who had loved one man with everything she had. She wept for Kiku, who had given all for her lover, even to the point of defiling her own body. I really did love him. The Blessed Mother had heard Kiku's cry distinctly. With tears pooling in her large eyes, the statue of the Immaculata nodded in strong affirmation. But unlike you, this body of mine has been repeatedly, totally violated. In response to Kiku's moan filled with such sorrow and pain, the weeping Blessed Mother shook her head vigorously. No, you are not violated in the least. Even though you gave your body to other men, you did it for just one man. The sorrow and misery you felt at those times has cleansed everything. You are not the least bit defiled. You lived in this world in order to love, just as my son did. Stretched out on the floor, Kiku's body was depleted of all energy and did not even stir. This snow, the statue continued, will probably continue all night long. This much snow will purify everything stained, everything foul. Ultimately, the streets of Nagasaki will become a land of pure whiteness, and just as this pure white snow will conceal all the blemishes and lewdness and pains and sins of humanity, your love will obliterate all the filth of the men who have touched you. Then the Blessed Mother urged Kiku, come, fear not, come with me." Time passed in utter silence. Outside the church, the large flakes of snow continued to fall. I will stop there and open it up for any questions, comments, objections, complaints, honor code notifications, anything you would like to ask or know less about. I mean more about. Anyone? Dare de muy yo. Yes, please.
I know that in some situations when an author's book is turned into a film, he may, like Philip Dick's Blade Runner, he complains about the movie. What's the relationship like between you and the author after the translation comes out? Does he have a say in the way it comes out, or do you work independently?
One of my great blessings is that Endo had no facility in English. His second language was French. He actually, after World War II, was in that first group of Japanese who were allowed to travel overseas, and he spent 2.5 years studying in France. So he learned French quite well, studied French Catholic writers, was greatly influenced by some of the great French writers like Mauriac, Bernanos. And so he never questioned me. He relied on word of mouth from people who did understand English, who read the English translations. The joke that he always made to me, and it was a joke, was everybody who's read my Japanese and your English says your English is much better than my Japanese. Okay, was a joke. There is only one occasion in the entire time that we worked together with the 4 novels I translated and the 2 short stories up to that point, and it comes at a critical moment in the Samurai, and if you'll let me just read a very brief passage from there. The samurai and his group with the priest return to Japan. They find out that all who are practicing Christianity or who have been baptized like the samurai are being imprisoned, tortured, and in some cases killed. Because this man attained prominence as an emissary representing his lordship from their domain, he is sentenced to death. He is ordered to commit suicide, seppuku, harakiri, hara-kiri if you wish. And as he is walking down a darkened hallway to the room where he is to slit his belly open, the man's servant, the samurai's servant, who himself has secretly converted to Christianity, says the following to him: "From now on, he, Christ, will be beside you." He heard Yozo's strained voice behind him. "From now on, he will attend you." The samurai stopped, looked back, and nodded his head emphatically. Then he set off down the cold, glistening corridor toward the end of his journey. That one passage, he will attend you. He will be with you. He will be your servant, your companion after this life. That is the one passage Endo questioned me about to know how I translated it, because it was such an important passage to him, and because the title samurai itself means one who serves a lord. He wanted to make sure that I had gotten it right. He had also been aware that there had been some serious issues with the English translation of silence, so he was a little more sensitive to it. Now, there are other contemporary Japanese writers who are quite good in English and who, in fact, are wealthy enough to have staffs that will go through translations. In the case of my translation of the Samurai, it was published, co-published between Harper and a press in Japan that publishes in English, Kodansha International. And Kodansha International had just been sued over a translation that someone else had done because it was so full of mistakes. And so they actually hired a Japanese scholar to go over my translation word for word to make sure they weren't going to get sued again because of me. They weren't. I squeaked through. So, thank you. Anyone else? Please. Uh-huh.
You spoke about some of the, or maybe it was Deep River, I'm sorry. You gave the dialogue in the Japanese, and then the rest of it, but then you translated afterwards, but then later on, when he was praying, it was directly in English. How do you choose when to keep the
It was important, I thought, in the context of the novel and to me as translator. That's actually Hindi that he's speaking to the woman, the Indian woman. It was important to me to convey the sense that he could speak to her in her language. But I also didn't want to throw off those who only know English and didn't know what in the world he was saying to her. So in quotation marks, I put the actual words in Hindi. And then outside the quote marks, I essentially repeated it in English for the benefit of the English reader. So that's why that's there that way. It's in the Japanese phonetic rendering of Hindi, yes. Yeah. Another reason I chose to do it that way. And of course, everything else is in English because it's in Japanese. Right? Of course, right. Okay, there was, yes, please.
It seems to me like there's a few different maybe temperaments that translators have when they approach a work, that some are trying to render as close of a literal translation as possible for their audience. And it seems that some translators want to just kind of return to the original ideas
Mm-hmm.
in the original text and kind of grapple with those, maybe taking huge liberties in their translation.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder what you feel your purposes are or your temperament as a translator.
Yeah. Like so many other things in my life, I'm kind of stuck in the middle between those two polar opposites. Years ago, when I was teaching at Berkeley, a very renowned translator by the name of Stephen Mitchell published a translation of the classical Chinese philosophical work, the Tao Te Ching. He was asked if he knew classical Chinese. And he said, no, but I qualified myself to do this translation through 5 years of karmic sweeping. Now, I'm not sure that totally substitutes for lack of any linguistic facility. I mean, I honor the spiritual quest he was on, but there's also the question of, do you take those words and actually reproduce them somehow to convey what you felt? And this is what I'm aiming for. I want to convey in English what I felt when I read in Japanese. I don't always succeed at that. There's no question. I don't know any translator that does. But we came a long way from Arthur Waley's translation of the Tale of Genji, because what he did, by the way, he never ever visited Japan. What he did is he would read the classical Japanese text, read a page or so, and then he would set it aside and reproduce in his own mind in English what he had just read. And he also took some more liberties, because there were a couple of short chapters in the Tale of Genji that he thought were inferior writing, so he just left them out. And he even added a kind of explanatory short chapter because he was afraid that the Western readers wouldn't stay with him. So he was taking great liberties, not as much as the karmic sweeper, but definitely liberties. Later on in the 1970s, when Edward Seidensticker retranslated the Tale of Genji into English, he was pushing much more toward the literal. Even though he had been a disciple of Arthur Waley, he was pushing more and more toward the literal. As a scholarly translation, it is excellent. As a readable translation, it suffers. Yes, I admire it greatly for its accuracy, for its ability to convey many of the depths of what's going on in the language of the 11th century in Japan. But for me, I lose some of the pleasure of reading literature. And that for me is a big concern. Whether I can reproduce that or not is a question of evaluating my talent as a translator, which sadly we do not have the time to do here today. I'm so sorry about that. I would love to engage in that conversation with you and discuss with you all of the gaffes that I have made in my translations, but we are out of time. Thank you for being here.
Join us in the Special Collections classroom. Thank you. That was fantastic.
Thank you. I hope it was okay. How you doing, Doug? Thanks for coming. Appreciate that.
Makes me want to read more of your translation.
Yeah, in your spare time, right? Oh, thank you. Appreciate you coming. No, that was fine. Not a problem.
So, and I just have a question.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned at the beginning how you, let's see, or how, just how,
Watch out.
oh, sorry.
closed up here.